Okay, for this next step in the video, I've taken that initial thumbnail that I created and I want to go ahead and blow that up. So I've duplicated it. It's on a new layer now. It's been expanded. I've got all this chicken scratch that's going on here, and I've got a new layer over on the right-hand side that's called initial line. I've taken my same exact pen that I was using before, and I've moved up the opacity to 100% because I want these lines to get set in stone a little bit better. And this is just going to be a second pass. I'm going to use this pass to start blocking in my color. Once I've got my color blocked in, and we're going to be able to see at that stage that this video is really starting to come together. So briefly, I want to talk to you about some of the line choices that I'm making here while I'm starting to get to the act of actually drawing this thing and really defining these initial shapes and ideas. And this process of going from really rough thumbnails to just an initial line sketch and then to blocking in the colors is a brilliant way to work because it allows you to be able to fail fast. So if you're messing something up, or if something isn't quite working at that particular stage, you're going to know early on within your drawing and your picture. So hopefully you can correct for it and make those adjustments that you need to. So I know that this tree here is going to sit up pretty high. It's going to be a really, really nice shape for me to start building in the rest of my forms and my shapes. And I'm just using a middle line structure right now. In one of the reference videos that I had you guys watch at the beginning of this, we had them explaining that thinner lines are going to recede further back, and it's important here, but again, I'm just using this stage to really help me decide what some of these tree forms and shapes are going to look like. So I can extend out that tree shape even further, but this is what's going to exist up at the top here. And we want to make sure that we get some good hangy stuff that's going on off of this tree. Same thing goes for vines. You know, I lived in Costa Rica for about 2 months back in 2019 before everything went nutso. And walking through the rainforest down there, I realized that so many of the trees have got other plants that are existing and are living off of those tree forms. So there we go. I think that's a pretty good tree shape right there. I'm just noting where I want some plant forms to be. One of the things that a lot of starting environment artists have trouble with, and I've seen students struggle with in the past, is what to be able to do when a tree touches the ground. And that's what I'm kind of solving for right now, is going through and just laying in these grassy forms, right? I'll do some kind of big leafy plant back here on the side just to connect it with the ground just a little bit better. Okay, so that's going to be another sort of leafy form right there. And that's going to work really, really well for me to be able to connect all these root systems that I want to create with the ground. Okay, so those are going to go all the way down here. These are going to sort of go over and down as well. And we've got this rocky cliff that we want to have in this space. There's a little bit of light that's going to start to exist there, so let's give it a little trees that are starting to poke their way out. Right? You got to think about within the forest that it's all a competition for who can get to the light the fastest. And that's what's going on. So this big one in the back, I think it'll be fun to be able to wrap it in vines. And this is a really fun exploratory process here when we're thinking about the details that we're creating. I'm trying not to overdo it on my details on this second pass, because I want to keep in mind, how much work I'm giving myself with every line that I create. So again, that's going to be another tree form. That's going to be a canopy back here. Give it one other side to it over here. This will look just a little bit more interesting. So now we've got that top right-hand corner. That's coming together pretty well. I'm going to keep working through this. I'm going to pause it for a sec, then we'll come back and we'll see that it's developed more. And after that, I'll give you guys any other tips that come up that while I'm sketching this thing, and then we'll get into blocking in the initial colors and the initial color space. Cool part is, once you've got this initial line work going on here, if this feels like it looks cool and it looks interesting to you at this stage, move on to the next stage. This is a great spot to be able to go in, adjust some of your shapes and forms. We'll probably do that once I've got some more stuff drawn out, just so that I can show you what that looks like to make a stronger composition overall. Fail fast. Iterate on your ideas early on so that when you do have a very complex painting, you're not having to do this at the very end. But once we get these initial color blocked shapes within our scene, oh, if it's working at that stage, you're probably going to end up with a good final painting as well. So that part is sort of a big pivotal step about whether or not you're going to continue with the work. But let's pause it for now. I'll be back in just a second with a more completed line drawing. Alrighty, and back to it. I've got my initial sketch figured out here, and this extra time really helped me a lot to be able to understand what I want to happen with this illustration. So the next step here is going to be blocking in where my darks and lights are going to be within this scene, but it should work pretty well. I'm going to have a really strong section. I want to create a new layer for you guys so you can see what I'm talking about here. I'll use red. I'm going to have a really strong division within this part. So everything back in here is going to be a very dark color, whereas where I want the light to really hit within my composition is going to be right on the snake's head. Okay, so this is going to be the brightest part of the entire illustration. There's going to be some other highlights, and this is something I want you guys to think about on the way in here, is how the light is actually going through and hitting your scene. So the light's going to come in this way. We're going to see some other really good highlights over here on the water, especially within this little section. It's going to be super bright, a little bit less down in this section, but yeah, there'll be some good highlights within this pool. So these are going to be sort of the brightest spots within the illustration. There can also be some highlights over on this section just to start to frame up our overall composition, but not too much. So where the red is at is going to be generally the darkest areas within this piece. The red section that I've drawn in already is considered sort of the back middle ground. You can see within this piece I've got a really strong foreground that I've created in the thicker lines. I've got sort of a middle area, which is where the snake is going to be. There is a little bit of far off background that exists way off to the side there, but all this stuff is going to be shaded pretty deeply. So this is going to be shaded. This is remembering all my lines, got a little bit of lag. Yeah. All this is going to be dark. Okay. This entire section underneath this tree is going to be dark. There's going to be a lot of dark areas. What I wanted to point out is most of it's going to be dark. We're going to have some highlights that are able to break through in certain little areas, but I've also left some room for a lot of good middle color going on. So with this blue, this sort of represents what my middle values are going to be. So no real strong highlights here. Or low lights. And then I've got my atmospheric perspective that's going to exist. And overall, this is going to be a pretty well balanced piece with directing the viewer's eyes to where I want them to go. I've got good shadow, darker regions that I'm thinking about within this. And this image currently looks absolutely nuts. But as we start to move into the blocking color section in the next video, this is going to help you understand what I mean by this. I think this one's pretty short right now. So actually, let's continue on into the blocking stage. I'm going to pause it now and start blocking in some of my colors. And when you come back, I'll show you what I mean by that and how my lines have come together to help me get those blocking regions right. Okay, I want to hop back in here real quick and explain to you guys while I'm starting to block in. I'm making some big color choices here between my 3 reference images to help guide me for how I'm going to set up this painting. So let me turn off my reference images for just a second and I'll show you what I got going on here. So I'm starting to create those dark regions that I was talking about. I've just got my snake blocked in here. I'm starting to create sort of what I want the far background work to be. And that's generally how I like to start with these. Start with the far background first, work into, I know that I'm working within the middle ground, so I don't want to have my purest blacks here within the middle ground. I can have my brightest highlights, but my blacks are going to be a little bit more less saturated. And the same thing's starting to happen with these tree trunks. So I want to make sure that I'm using good color usage here. I know that the things are going to get darker and more saturated towards my foreground because of that atmospheric perspective. But for these middle ground trees that are going on here, as well as what's going to be happening with the trees down in this little area, they're roughly in the same plane. I want to make sure that I'm picking a good color choice. So I've got a couple different options here within my reference images, right? Each one of these, you notice that they've suspiciously hidden the tops of some of the trees within it. But I do have some bushes and some foliage that exist within this middle ground that's going to give me a good idea of how I should handle my treetops. I like this color right here. These are looking pretty nice over here. And then in this one, we've got some really, really cool stuff that's happening with the trunk. That's what brought me to these colors originally. But if I don't exactly have what I need for the problem that I'm trying to solve for, I do have some good middle ground colors here where I've got my darker colors within the shadows, and then we can see them moving over into their highlights within this section. So this is a good color swatch for me to be able to pull from when I'm going in and creating these layered tree forms. So this particular color here is probably going to work well. I'm going to have a lot of contrast moving over into these brighter colors as I continue to color in my trees. But for a good, safe first pass on these, I'm going to start with that very, very dark color, and we should see some pretty cool results. So stay tuned, and we'll keep on popping in when I've got good stuff to tell you. Okay, so what I'm looking for now, I've got a lot of my stuff kind of blocked in. I had to go through and add a little bit more shadow to the rock sections within this, but I've been looking for a good sort of middle grass color for this entire scene. I know what my base color that I kind of work back from and then forwards from for a lot of my stuff I've already solved for within this scene, but there needs to be sort of just a whatever grass color that exists somewhere within this space. So let's see here. Here's another example of just sort of these middle tree colors that aren't really going to matter too much, but I want to give them a little bit of definition. So my middle grass color that I'm going to define. So for all this green that I'm laying in here, it's not going to be all that inconsequential. It blends in with the other colors pretty well. I'm not going to be using this to direct the viewer's eye to any kind of real direction or anything. But this next green color that I'm going to use is going to be kind of my base standard for where the light's hitting, but it's not really all that important. It's just sort of the 70% part of those illustrations that we've been talking about. So I'm going to use this green. If I picked it right, yeah, it should be almost directly in the middle. So I've got plenty of room to be able to move up in saturation, plenty of room to be able to move back. And yeah, so let's just go ahead and under the rocks. Let's call this one the over the rocks and middle grass. Yeah, so I'm going to do a big wipe since I have all kinds of different colors that are going to get this green here. And this, when I go back in and start really painting out some of these sections, yeah, you can see that it's going to fill up this whole section over here, this little section. I was just having some trouble trying to figure out what am I going to fill this with. And it's going to be one solid coat of green. It's going to get some extra painting on the inside of it. And there's going to be a lot of different tones and values. And this is kind of going to be my ambient occlusion layer that handles a lot of my big shadows around some of my stronger regions within the piece. There we go. And as I'm starting to paint this in, you should be able to see that a lot of this is creating some answers and choices for me along the way that I just need to go ahead and make. There we go, starting to work pretty strongly. The stuff within the foreground, I'm going to make that quite a bit darker. There's one more thing I want to show you from my reference images that I remembered that I want you guys to take special consideration in. So this is pretty cool what they're doing here with these trees. So this happens all the time and within jungle pieces, big old mountain pieces. Anywhere that there's going to be a lot of moisture in the air, you can create this kind of light fog on the ground that's existing. You can see how the colors get less saturated and almost completely disappears with this tree form, but it becomes more visible as you move up. This kind of light fog trick here, I'm going to use it throughout my composition, and it's really going to help give it a more professional kind of look when we get finished up with this thing. All right. So for right now, we've got a whole bunch of boring local color that's not really looking all that great on this painting, but it is a good position with the flat color. There we go. For me to get an idea of what I want to push forward. Once I start getting in the foreground elements that are going to be quite a bit darker, this should start to make a little bit more sense for where it is that we're heading with it. So one more jump forward in time, and we should have the blocking in of the colors complete. Okay, so now I've got my initial composition blocked in with its first round of color. I've taken my line pieces or my original line art and dropped down the opacity for that for like 43% or even lower to 24%. We can see that the painting right now really isn't looking all that strong, which is totally okay, but I can still look at this and start to make some decisions. I've learned a lot through this step of blocking in the colors. My next pass, what I like to do is go through after this and start working into my deeper shadows and doing a quick shadow pass. That's going to help me start to establish where the lighting is coming from within this piece. I'm also going to try and work more of these purple colors into the rest of it, and maybe start to put a couple highlights on this snake in the middle ground. But we're going to start to see this continue to come together. Overall, I think it's a composition that can work. We've still got some good line structure, good shapes that are happening in here. We just got to make sure that we're really pulling out the contrast in this center area and where I'm thinking about this sort of beam of light to hit. One more thing that I'm doing, I'm using one of the brush packs that I shared for you guys out within the discussion post, or sorry, within the announcements for the course. And this is the chip brush, which works pretty good for this initial blocking stage. It's got a little bit of push and a little bit of transparency to it. And it's going to allow me to start kind of stamping in all these color regions. So it's looking a little bit messy now, but we've got our color shapes defined. And as we start to push in our highlights and our lowlights, I think that this piece is going to come together splendid as we move forward. So thank you so much for checking out this section. In the next video, we're going to be pushing in those shadows as well as the highlights, and you're going to start to see a pretty radical transformation with this piece. So moving from the line art, the thumbnail, to blocking in the color, this next step, I feel good about the overall composition, and it should just get better and better from here, and hope that you feel the same way about what you're working on.